Welcome to Press Coverage. I'm Theo Gremminger. At Press Coverage, I try to bring you the sharpest guests and help you find the edges that you need to win in fantasy football. And I'm stoked today to be joined by Dwain McFarland. I podcasted with Dwain a number of times, but this is his first time on Press Coverage. So welcome to the show, Dwain. We're going to talk a little bit later today about a really, really interesting and actionable article that you just dropped over at Fantasy Life about how age impacts wide receiver performance. But Dwain, how's everything going? You're crushing it over there, man.
Hey, man, I really appreciate that. I feel like I'm the person, honestly, getting to come hang with the other sharp person on this show. So always excited to come join you, Theo. We've known each other for a long time. We've met way back in the day, back in the FFPC streets, in high stakes, mid stakes drafts. And I know you're always out there grinding drafts. And me personally, that's my favorite part of the community is the other people that are out there drafting a ton, like just because there's so much to learn. We can do all this analysis and everything, and it's super important. And we want this actionable stuff. But I just love the people that are out there, putting the money in and getting after it. And man, like you're one of the people I know that drafts the most. So I love hanging with you.
Yeah, and I'd say that you have become a really huge voice in the fantasy community. Obviously, Fantasy Life has a really big reach. But that was the cachet that you had where there was a lot of people that I would consider to be some of the best drafters in America, the NFFC most successful drafter and the FFPC most successful drafter. Like there's not a single person that for a few year period was not listening to you and Brian Drake on the Fantasy Football Hustle talking about your strategy. And Dwain, like you're not building yourself up. Like to anybody listening out there who's like, oh, I've seen Dwain's work on Fantasy Life. That's in my email this morning. Dwain also has crushed it as a high stakes player. Dwain has receipts to prove it. You have multiple top 5 FFPC finishes. So big hat tip to you. You bring it kind of on both sides of the fence. And that's what we're looking for here at Press Coverage, because we want to help our listeners win. And anybody who's listened to Press Coverage or Dynasty Life for that matter, or First Class Fantasy, there's a couple of questions that I ask every single guest, and it sort of opens up a lot of things for what your process is this year. If you could know the final stats of any player in 2024, who would it be, Dwain? And specifically, let's look at veterans, non-rookies.
Oh, this is a really good question. So what I want to do is get the most information I can out of my answer. So for veteran, I'm going to go Raheem Mostert, because that also tells me about Achane, who I've been absolutely smashing in drafts, because I just think the upside is so intense for Achane. Obviously, everybody gets it. Everybody saw it. You saw him throw up the 50 points. Like this could be the player you need no matter what. But if I know what happens with Mostert, I know should I be drafting Raheem Mostert in round 8 or 9, because it's a pretty good value if he comes anywhere near to what he did last year. And he's a guy I also like drafting if I don't already have Achane on the team. A couple times I've taken them together. But again, I get that additional information around Achane. If Mostert absolutely smashes, well, then that probably tells me I might be too high on Achane, even though, I think all the upside is in play given his skill set. But if Mostert doesn't do well, well, then that tells me I should just keep on keeping on with Achane. And there's a chance, really, he could just be the league winner this year. You getting Achane in round 2 or round 3. If we suddenly come out in week 1, I've said this many times, we go and we look at the utilization report, and it suddenly says that this dude got 60% of the snaps or 60% of the rushing attempts. If you don't have him on your team, I will tell you, you're going to have a sinking feeling, because you're going to think, oh shit, Achane is going to be a league winner as a round 2 or 3 pick. So I like going with Mostert because you get multiple pieces of information. And then also you get a little bit on Jaylen Wright. If for some reason Mostert falls off, well, that makes me want to take even more of Jaylen Wright, because if for some reason Mostert goes down and they do want to save some of Achane, like I don't think anybody thinks they're going to suddenly give Achane 75% of the carries. But people that come out, it's so funny when you say this on social media. You be like, man, what happens if he gets 60%? It's funny how many people will assume they know, and they'll go, no way he's getting that. He can't stay healthy. We've seen so many backs that were of his archetype that for so long people thought, oh, he can't do it. He can't stay healthy, that eventually did. Austin Eckler is a great example in recent years. Now, Austin Eckler, yes, he did beef up and get his body into a position to be able to handle that workload. But Jamal Charles, he was never this dude never was even 205 pounds. So people are so sure that something's not going to happen and that it's going to be a workload split. It could easily be Achane as the lead back, and Mostert really is more of a change pace. That's in the range of outcomes. So I would love to know that information. I think you kill 3 birds with 1 stone, and obviously Jaylen Wright becomes a super duper handcuff if Mostert's going to be out any period of time.
I love it. And people continually will say, Theo, you talk about the same players every single show. So I did not prompt Dwain to talk about
Who do you always talk
Achane,
about?
but I'm
well, you should be
100%,
talking about Achane
100%.
every show. I'm sorry, you just should.
Yeah, and we just had John Daigle on press coverage, and he shares your enthusiasm for Devon Achane. It's sort of this sort of opportunity is not there in the 3rd round most years, and people poking holes in his game. You saw people fading Alvin Kamara heading into year 2. You referenced Jamal Charles, CJ2K. Certain outliers are outliers for a reason, but it doesn't mean that they can't take that next step. And I think that a lot of people don't talk about the unknown upside with Devon Achane as a receiver. Mike McDaniel might unlock that a lot more this year. That guy in space in that offense a couple more times a game, that's very scary. So, and I love that you bring up Jaylen Wright, because that's a guy where when I draft a Mostert or I draft an Achane, even though it's an expensive proposition to draft like Devon Achane in round 3 and then Jaylen Wright in round 10, or Raheem Mostert, wherever you get him, whenever the dead zone kind of ends, and then double tap with Jaylen Wright. It's that offense is so high powered that you could see 2 starting running backs every week and 2 guys inside of the top 20 rankings every week. But remind everybody about the utilization report, because that's something that you did years ago, and it's sort of become your MO.
Yeah, and now we've got all the tools over at Fantasy Life where folks can go check all this out. But like actually, Achane and Mostert's a great example, because you can quickly go in and look at these games, and you can see games where Achane actually had Mostert on the field with him. 49% of rushing attempts went to Mostert. Only 40% went to Achane. But guess what? Achane scored 19.8 fantasy points per game in those games. So really, guys, I mean, are we really complaining? Now, I know his efficiency could come down, and it probably will. Like, he had a season that was so insane that it has nowhere to go but down. But does that mean that he suddenly becomes a 4-yard per carry player? No, I think that's where people get it twisted. So maybe he doesn't average, 7 yards a carry or whatever this year, and it's 6 or 5.5. That's okay. That's still really good. And you bring up a really good point that the utilization points out around the work in the passing game. And they prioritized Achane last year when they got him on the field with a 25% targets per route run. That was much higher than what we saw from Mostert. And we also saw him starting to take over some of that long down and distance work at the end of the season. So I like your call on Achane and how he could potentially do more out of the backfield. And it doesn't have to necessarily just be taking over a certain role. It can just be you get to play with Mike McDaniel, and when you're out there, he'll find ways to make it happen, whether it's on 1st down, whether it's on 3rd down. It doesn't necessarily matter so much in that offense because, as you talked about, it's so high-powered, and you have that innovative mind that's helping to drive it.
So, Dwain, one thing that's been very cool with your work at Fantasy Life is you evaluating the rookie classes. And that's something that I know you've been very passionate about for the last 2 seasons. If you could know the final stats of any of these rookies, who would it be?
Rome Odunze. And again, you're trying to get more bang for your buck here, but Odunze did fall 1 tier below Malik Nabers and Marvin Harrison, who were in tier 1 of the rookie supermodel. So the rookie supermodel, what it does is it goes back and it looks at data all the way back to the 2018 class, and we've modeled it out to see, okay, what things historically in college have meant success in the NFL. Obviously, draft capital is one of those things. The pedigree of the school that you play for and how you were recruited, that's something. Then there's all the different data points that we normalize for the team that you're on. And Odunze would have been the top wide receiver in many of our recent classes. It just so happens that he was out there with Malik Nabers as well as Marvin Harrison Jr. Now, he lands in a spot where, yeah, it's a crowded passing attack, and we have a rookie quarterback in Caleb Williams. So I'm not saying Odunze is guaranteed to smash this year, but you're taking Marvin Harrison at the end of round 1 or beginning of round 2. You're then taking Malik Nabers now pretty much at the 2-3 turn in most formats versus where you're getting Rome Odunze falling to you sometimes now at the end of round 6. So that uncertainty, because you got to deal with Keenan Allen, you got to deal with DJ Moore. Those are certainly factors. But Keenan Allen, again, about to be entering age 32 season if we're rounding based on the first day of the season, which is the way I did the age research that we'll look at here in just a little bit. there's a lot of paths here for Odunze, but the main thing being he's a young, really good player, and you're getting him in round 6. I feel there's just too big of a gap between him and where Marvin Harrison and Malik Nabers are going. I think he should be probably going more like round 5. I thought he was a little too high in drafts right after the NFL draft because of all the things we just talked about. But now it's kind of swung too far the other way. The other thing is, if you know how Odunze does, that also probably tells you about Keenan Allen, and it gives you some insight on DJ Moore. And you're having to take DJ Moore round 3. You're having to take Keenan Allen right now in round 5.
I love that you said Rome Odunze, and I haven't gotten that answer many times, but it makes a lot of sense because we're looking for these incredible talent profiles at affordable ranges of the draft. And there's some parallels between CeeDee Lamb's rookie season and Rome Odunze's rookie season. You're talking about a crowded wide receiver room. At the time of CeeDee Lamb's rookie year, we had Amari Cooper, whose ADP was similar to DJ Moore's. Michael Gallup was steamed up that year.
That's a really good call.
Yeah. So it's I'm of the opinion, like, you want exposure to Rome Odunze. In redraft, it takes a little bit different sort of build because you might not be able to rely on him in the beginning of the year. But in best ball, you want a lot of exposure to this guy because even if it's not consistent, the spike weeks are going to be there. He's too good of a player not to.
And if one of the other guys go down, man, like, I mean, that's the thing. Chaos, you know how this works. Chaos just happens. And I think there's a chance Rome Odunze is the wide receiver 2 on the team already, and that will be out there in their 2 wide receiver sets, and then it will be Keenan Allen coming onto the field in the 3 wide receiver sets. Like, so that's something I think we just need to pay attention to in camp. But that could also create a slight edge for Odunze just being out there. If I had to pick today who I think is going to run more routes this season, I'm starting to lean towards Odunze, and I didn't always feel that way, but that's just, again, it's early, but that's based on the stuff we're hearing out of minicamp and OTA so far.
And Dwain's supermodel stuff is still up at Fantasy Life. You can go and look at that, sort of his take on some of these rookies. It's very actionable still, even though it's a little bit old at this point. Let's talk about offenses as a whole, Dwain. Every single season, we see a few offenses that are mispriced ADP-wise and can lead like 3 or 4 guys to huge ADP wins. It happens every year. We saw last year with Tampa Bay, Mike Evans and Rachaad White both going in an affordable range, propped up. Baker Mayfield ends up being a shock QB1 the year before, the Seattle Seahawks. And it happens towards the top of the food chain as well. Last year, the Lions, obviously, everyone was propelled up. The year before, we saw like Philly, Miami, you name it. It happens every single season. What's an offense when you look at ADP and you look at how guys are priced and you say, this is an offense where we could see like 4 ADP winners?
Yeah, I think the Panthers are for sure one of those. I know they were absolutely terrible last year, so there's nowhere to go really but up. But you get Dave Canales coming over, who's done nice things, obviously, with Geno, with Baker, and he's going to now be working with the number 1 overall pick from the 2023 NFL draft, Bryce Young. I know people immediately want to dismiss Bryce Young, but look, man, coming in from college, playing your first year in the pros, it's not easy, and he had zero help. We had Adam Thielen at age 33 operating out of the slot, and they actually vibed really well early in the season until other teams finally said, yeah, we're not going to give you that anymore. We're going to try to take away Adam Thielen. We don't care if you're going to play him in the slot. And Thielen's at a point in his age where, he couldn't necessarily overcome that. Maybe 27-year-old Adam Thielen, even double cover from the slot would have been okay, but not age 33. So I think you look at that. You look at what they did on the offensive line, where, when you look at Bryce Young, I think he was 61 sacks, 64, somewhere there. Like, he was the 2nd most sacked quarterback or 3rd most last year under a ton of pressure. So they had 2 brand new guards, big upgrades there to help handle that pressure. Then you go add Diontae Johnson. People can say what they want about Diontae Johnson, but he earns targets like a wide receiver 1. He can get open on the outside against man coverage, against zone coverage. He can win in the intermediate and underneath areas of the route. We'll see if he can develop more of that long game. I don't think we for sure know that about Diontae Johnson because he played with noodle arm Ben Roethlisberger, and then Kenny Pickett just wasn't very willing to go downfield either. So we'll see. Bryce Young, Alabama, was really good at buying time in the pocket, escaping the pocket, and hitting those big plays. Didn't see that so much, in his rookie season, but he was still willing to get into the scramble drill, just didn't always have someone to throw the ball to. So I could easily see Bryce Young being a guy that come week 3, people needing a, quarterback, whatever they have is not working out. They're going back. They're like, okay, like I'm going to go pick up Bryce Young. Diontae Johnson, He's already given us a wide receiver 8 overall finish just 3 years ago. Like, so we already know that the ceiling's there. The floor is probably a wide receiver 3. I think his median outcome this year is probably a wide receiver 2. They also drafted Xavier Legette at the end of the first round. Rookie supermodel, wasn't crazy about Xavier Legette, but where he's going right now in fantasy drafts, I'm on board with taking shots on him. He's a guy that didn't break out until his 5th year of college, but when he did, like, Theo, he broke out in a really big way, and it was in the SEC. He played really well against some big teams. Not the typical profile I like, but again, people aren't overdrafting him. So when I look at all those different pieces, and now Thielen is the 3rd or 4th option, even though he's aging. They also added Jatavian Sanders in the draft. We don't typically expect a lot out of a round 4 rookie tight end, but they're trying. They're trying. And so when I look at this team, I see the potential for a lot of improvement on offense. And hey, if they go from worse to like middle of the pack, that's going to mean that there's value somewhere along the way. And I haven't even mentioned Jonathan Brooks, who is the top rookie in the rookie supermodel. I want to say with Brooks, like, that's a guy that I was all over early based on the research. The industry has definitely come around on him, but like this guy's a stud. He just happened to be stuck behind Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson at the University of Texas. But guys that finished in his range in the rookie supermodel, like over 70% of them went on to have a top 24 running back finish in their first 2 seasons. Will he get there? Maybe not in year 1, because he could start slow, might not be ready for camp due to the ACL injury he had last November. But man, at the end of the year, I'll tell you this, once the dude gets on the field, I'm not worried about Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders. I think he will absolutely take over. And I think he's the type of player that even if he's only 90, 85% this year, by the time you really need him, I still think that's going to be something you're going to be really excited about having on your fantasy team.
And Brooks has that 3-down skill set where he's going to be very underrated as a receiver. And if Bryce Young doesn't turn it around quite like you think he could, maybe check down city to Brooks in positive game scripts would be okay as well. I think that's a nice outcome. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to dive into some draft strategy questions. And then we're going to talk about some of these old wide receivers. Big year for old wide receivers. Dwayne's going to let you know which ones he's concerned about and which ones we can go ahead and draft.
Hey, why do we partner with the FFPC? Because they have the widest variety of fantasy football formats, and it's the easiest place to find all types of fantasy football contests in the world. What if you want to play for high stakes? Well, they have a $6 million prize pool with their Fantasy Players Championship. They also have way too early best ball leagues that start in February and Dynasty leagues. They have the closest thing to a liquid market for orphans that there is in all of Dynasty. And the FFPC has sponsored us for half a decade because we are actually delivering information that can help fantasy gamers, and they're generating so much interest and bringing in so many new users, casual users even. The FFPC creates a unique experience where you can both compete against the best and make money. Use promo code UNDERWORLD to get $25 off your first team. $25 off your first team at the FFPC with promo code UNDERWORLD. Go get it!
Welcome back to Press Coverage. Theo Gremminger with Dwain McFarland of Fantasy Life. Dwayne, let's talk a little bit about it. You talked about Davante Adams, who's sort of everybody's got a strong opinion about him and where he goes. But let's talk about another running back that's very polarizing, and that's Kyren Williams. This was a player that last season had an unbelievable year, and he was like found money for drafters who either drafted him in the 18th round, 19th round in FFPC, NFFC. Some people took shots in underdog, not too many, or picked him up as a waiver wire addition, which so many people did, and he ended up, winning you leagues. And he happened to be a waiver wire pickup the same week as Puka Nacua. So a lot of people are getting him for cheap and then those fab dollars, relatively speaking. Where are you at on him this year? This is a guy whose ADP's adjusted, but like Achane, this is a polarizing player.
Yeah. So early on in drafts, like, I was on the record as he's a complete fade because he was at one point going at the 1-2 turn. Again, it feels like forever ago now, but when we first started drafting best ball teams, that's where he was at. Then he slowly fell down to the end of the second round. And so I did start buying a little bit. I wasn't overboard though. I was like, okay, I'm going to buy a little bit of this in case it turns back around, things go back the other way. But it was really just more market driven. But now he sometimes falls to the middle of the third round, Theo. And I don't click on him all the time, but I'm certainly open to taking Kyren Williams. I think here's the big challenge with Kyren. When you look at the history of running backs without significant draft capital, meaning guys going later than round 3 that reached that 15 fantasy points per game, what did they in year 1, right, of their career? How did they do in year 2? Okay. Well, we've got Alfred Morris. That's your first example here. He went from 16.1 fantasy points per game down to 11.6. But I think we can poke holes in Alf because Alf never had that passing game element, right? So he was really dependent on the touchdowns. The next year, RG3 went down. Not great. Andre Ellington. There's a blast from the past. You remember that name, Theo? Andre Ellington.
People got burned on Andre Ellington.
I got burned big time on Andre Ellington, but he actually was the profile we like, which is more like an Achane. You know, he was this young, explosive player that could work in the passing game, could catch passes. 15.2 fantasy points, went down to 7.7. Devonta Freeman, 21.8. He actually continued to succeed. The next year, 17.9. So he took a step back, but that's a good example of what you would be hoping for Kyren Williams. Then you go to Jordan Howard, 15.5 fantasy points down to 12.6. But again, another guy that could not get involved in the passing attack at all. James Robinson went from 17.9 down to 12.7 in his second season. And then finally, Myles Gaskin went from 16.8 to 10.3. So overall, the history has not been good to what's happened, you know, with those players. And a lot of those players didn't really pick up a lot of extra competition in the following season, yet they still failed to produce. So I think drafters are right to have some concerns about Kyren Williams. You also look at the workload that they want to put on him. You heard me earlier talk about, people can't for sure say that Achane can't get to 60% of the workload. Well, I do get worried about a guy like Kyren Williams at 80% of the workload. So I think it has to come down some, but he's obviously shown that he can carry the ball and, you know, get a really decent workload. I do think he's very dependent on getting all of that volume. Now, he's a pretty efficient running back last season. He's a good player in the pass game. He's got the ability, but they also do have Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, who a lot of the targets are going to go to. So he's a guy that I am still mixing in, Theo. So I'm not a hard fade. I'm also not a hard buy. I'm not picking the guy every time he gets to me in the third round. But I'm very curious on your thoughts with Kyren, because he is a guy that, like, part of the data tells me run. The other part of the data is like, you know, maybe we're overreacting. One name I didn't mention here because it's further back, but had Twitter been around in its form that we have today, the year after Arian Foster kind of broke out at the end of that year for the Houston Texans, everybody would have been doing this fade thing. They would have been like, man, Arian Foster, he's a late round pick, not going to do anything, you know. And that year, I believe, is the year Ben Tate got hurt. But the next year, everyone would have been for sure fading Arian Foster because Ben Tate would have been back and he was a second round pick. And guess what? You would have been very wrong. Arian Foster went on to completely destroy it. So there's a chance the guy is really good. I do wish that he was a little bit bigger because he's so dependent on that supersize volume.
For me, it's been a guy where, like you, I was completely fading him. We had Nelson Sousa. He's on Nelson Sousa's fade list this year. Matt Kelly's about as anti-Kyren Williams as anybody in fantasy right now. So everybody's in my ear about this one. But like you, when he fell to the third round, and I think we might even see a little bit more downside in that ADP, then I'll mix in some exposure, certainly on underdog and large-scale tournaments. When it comes to like the FFPC main event, when it comes to like the NFFC primetime, big, high stakes drafts, I don't necessarily see myself drafting him unless the ADP really corrects, because it's an opportunity cost thing for me. If I pass up on all these wide receivers in that range to take Kyren Williams, and I could just take Derrick Henry a couple picks later, who, despite his age, I think is in a better offense and in a more sure situation with less threats behind him. Like, Blake Corum is a much better running back than anything Baltimore has behind the big dog. So it's sort of an opportunity costing for me and a potential value trap when it comes to Kyren Williams. But I can see the appeal. If you're doing 150 underdog entries, then you don't want to be without Kyren Williams in case you're wrong, sort of thing. But I don't think it's like I'm going to pass on him and he's going to return this incredible value. Billy has him at running back 15 in our rankings, and I think Billy in his projections, I think Billy's kind of about right. Running back 15 would make sense, but then you factor in the foot injury, the threat of Blake Corum behind him, and if he misses some time and Blake Corum plays well, then we're looking at a situation where maybe Blake Corum's in the goal line role where Williams was so effective in last year. So for me, Dwayne, I'm probably mostly out.
Yeah. I'm like I said, the research, just looking at, some of the comps based on draft capital and everything, it's not necessarily worked out. It did for Devonta Freeman, but for most of those guys, they were guys that you really wish that you didn't have. And if you expand that research really, to include not just guys that did that in their first year moving into the second year, we start to get the veterans like Kenyon Drake that were big busts. Damian Williams was a huge bust one year. So anytime you get a kind of unheralded player where we don't really have a lot of indicators of talent other than the fact they just got a lot of opportunity the year before, that can be a really tricky situation that we want to be careful with.
So you talked about Achane. We've talked about Kyren Williams. Last year was a year for huge outlier ADP wins. Puka Nacua, Nico Collins, Sam Laporta, CJ Stroud. We had a ton of quarterbacks who were picked up off the waiver wire and were usable. Who's your favorite this year's version of? Maybe a guy who, Rashad White. There's plenty of guys last year where you could say, I'm looking at this year's ADP, and this guy sort of profiles like he could have that sort of magical return on investment for drafters.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, like, when I think about some of these players, like obviously there's dart throws we can have where we know there's upside. Like I love drafting Marshawn Lloyd, with an aging Josh Jacobs, but we don't know for sure what kind of role Marshawn Lloyd, is going to have. We didn't necessarily know with Achane either, to be honest. Lloyd has that explosive profile. He does a lot of bad things as a runner that drive coaches nuts, so that could be a problem for him. But Marshawn Lloyd's my most drafted running back. But the guy that I lean to the most is Jaylen Warren. And I know he's round 9. He's not at the end of your draft. But, every year is different. But when I look at Jaylen Warren, he definitely has the profile that we're looking for. This is a guy that can get it done on the ground. This is a guy, when you look at his ability as a target earner, he could be on that same level with the high-end elites that we have seen be so good for so many years. You got your CMCs, your Camaras, you got these guys that we know the work that they're going to get in the passing game. So I think that there's a lot to like there with Jaylen Warren. So he's one of my most drafted running backs, even though there's a little bit of ambiguity. What's going to happen? How are they going to split that up? You got the Arthur Smith factor. There's a lot of things that are weird about the Jaylen Warren situation. But when I look at a guy that could we look up by week 4, and I'm trying to say a likely player, not like a complete long shot. We look up by week 4 and we go, well, crap. I could have got that guy in round 8 or 9 or later, and now they're changing a fantasy season. I feel like Jaylen Warren is definitely on that list.
I love that one. I'm glad you said Marshawn Lloyd. We're on the same page on a lot of these guys, unprompted. Marshawn Lloyd.
What's funny, Corum is my second most drafted running back, so maybe I'm telling on myself on the Kyren.
I got to catch up on Corum exposure, but Marshawn Lloyd, I can't help myself. Dynasty startups, best ball, redraft. I take them all the time. It's sort of a Jacobs fade. But I love the Jaylen Warren call. Talking about a guy who had 60 receptions last year. We've seen him last year have over 1,000 combined yards, doubled up his rushing yards, doubled up his receptions, and all of our metrics on Player Profiler, he checks off every single box. Like he hits the top 10 in so many efficiency metrics. And for all his faults as a guy that we can't store, I personally can't stand in terms of what he does with pass catchers and Arthur Smith. He's been sort of a running back whisperer, Cordero Patterson, Tyler Algier, and then he was a smart enough guy to give the big dog the ball every single time in Tennessee. So I think we'll get.
Didn't do it with Bijan, but okay.
Well, that's right. But at the end of the day, if we're like there was frustrating moments. But if I told you before the year last year, Bijan's going to be RB10, you'd say, okay, you know what? I guess I'll take it. It's a little disappointing. He didn't completely fall flat. I mean, you can't really mess up Bijan Robinson, I guess, as an offensive coordinator. He's so good. But yeah, Jaylen
Well, you
Warren,
can only give him 30% of the carries inside the 5, and that would piss me off. Oh, that happened.
It's going to be revenge of the Bijan Robinson drafter this year, Dwayne. Don't worry about that one. We'll get it back.
We're good. Yeah, but with Jaylen Warren, you're mentioning it. Like, here's the thing. Like, if you study what's the most sticky year over year for running backs, what's interesting, it's actually volume. Efficiency, the two things running backs typically own, and it's still like the R squared value is in the mid 3.3s. It's their yards after contact and their missed tackles force. And Jaylen Warren obviously was elite in both of those areas last year. If you look at his yards after contact, 3.6, that was just behind Achane, and James Conner was on this list at 3.9. James Conner was out there bossing last year. Mostert was right there at 3.4. But then if you look at, the missed tackles force per attempt, 0.36 or 36%. That by far was number one in the league. And then the biggest thing, right, is your ability as a receiver. This dude had a 16% target share, 28% targets per route run. That was behind only Alvin Kamara. And then you had Breece Hall just behind him at 27%. So that's what you're looking for. What can really differentiate you? Yeah, we like the efficiency, and that's really good about him. And because if he gets a full-time role, we know it's going to go down a little bit, but it can really make things pop. But it's the ability in the receiving game, guys. That's what you want to be targeting. Guys that, if somehow things broke their way, they can be on the field all the time, but not just be out there. They're actually good enough to generate their own targets. And typically what you need is a profile that's more like a Jaylen Warren, a Kamara. And he's not quite on the Kamara CMC level. He doesn't do as much work down the field, which is something I like to see more of. But man, this guy is just, he can do it all. So if you ever if we ever found ourselves at a point this year, for whatever reason, Najee's injured, they just finally say, they didn't bring Najee. They didn't sign Najee to his 5th year, deal for his rookie. They let that go. So they're pretty much done with Najee. So at any point this year, they could just be like, oh, we're going with Jaylen Warren. And if that happens, I promise you, you're going to immediately be ranking him in your top 10 running backs. And when you can get that later in your draft, that's something that you absolutely want to be targeting. So you want those pass catching skills. And the other thing I look at, Theo, is once I get to Jaylen Warren's name and I start thinking, who else can I get that's really like Jaylen Warren after I pass him? I think you could make an argument for Tajay Spears, right? That he would be there. If Austin Eckler just happened to be hurt last year, like he's shown in the past that he's been a pass catcher, but he's really past the age where we want to be targeting him. Like, he's not someone I want to be. I'll take some Austin Eckler, but I don't want to be centering my strategy around Austin Eckler. But once you get past that, man, like, you got another name for me that's really a good target earner that has the upside that Jaylen Warren has? There's not one. There's backs that could come in and get volume because
Charbonnet maybe in the Ryan Grubb offense.
He isn't on the same level, but I agree.
No.
He is a good pass downs guy.
Yeah, so I love it. And also you brought up Diontae Johnson. If there's a slower out the gate development with guys like Roman Wilson, maybe a little less reliance on a Calvin Austin, maybe Muth doesn't bounce back quite as well, they might be forced to use Jaylen Warren in the passing game even more than they might like. So there's a lot of outs there, and certainly he checks off all the boxes talent-wise, and we're getting this ADP discount because of the presence of Najee Harris. And Najee Harris has gone 2 straight seasons without delivering on his ADP. He's been a big bust at ADP for 2 straight years, and now people are sort of back to, I'm going to click Najee Harris. So I'm completely with you on that one. We're going to talk a little bit later in the show about these older wide receivers, but let's talk about 2 of the younger wide receivers in football, and that's Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Nabers. You've now had 3 out of the last 4 years, Dwayne, where we've had a rookie wide receiver inside of like top 5 land in PPR scoring at the wide receiver position. And now we're having to pay for it when it comes to these elite weapons. Marvin Harrison Jr. is by far the highest drafted in ADP rookie wide receiver we've ever seen. And Malik Nabers would have been historically the highest drafted rookie wide receiver ever if there wasn't a Marvin Harrison Jr. So we have the top 2 in history. And I still want to click the button on those guys. Are you with me on this? Is this a guys that are priced correctly and are going to return value sort of where they're priced in the wide receiver market and the overall ADP market? Or could this be one where you want to pump the brakes a little bit?
Look, I think all of this, you have to look at the context. Number one, I'll say Marvin Harrison is the number 1 wide receiver ever in the Fantasy Life rookie supermodel. So, I mean, like, love him. And then Malik Nabers was right there behind him. So I love both guys as prospects. I don't really have doubts about them. Could one of them miss? Yeah, there's no sure anything. So there's always that with a rookie. We haven't seen it at the next level, and some percentage of them will miss. However, both of these profiles have a very, very high hit rate, based on like what I've studied historically. So I'm not going to overly be concerned about that, but you could make the argument that, okay, great, I have Marvin Harrison versus taking, Chris Olave. You could say, well, I know that Chris Olave at least can give me a low end wide receiver 2, high end wide receiver 3. He might not ever become an elite wide receiver 1 like we want him to, but I at least know that floor is there. So I could get that. Like, I could see yourself saying, okay, I'm going to take Olave over Harrison. I'm going to take Olave over, Malik Nabers. We'll get to Nabers in a second because he goes later, so we don't want to compare him to this range. But for me, it comes down to he's wide receiver 9 overall. Like, let's just forget how early wide receivers are going. That is what it is. And you've got to adapt or you get left out. So if you guys, you can't, there's really not a counter strategy. You can't just load up on running backs while everybody else takes the receivers, because then all the receivers are gone. We know receivers is the most talent driven position as far as the skill players outside of quarterbacks. And if you draft all those good wide receivers, we know we can still find running back volume on the waiver wire because of injuries or later in our draft. When you look later in your draft, you're not likely to find really good wide receivers. I get it. Puka Nacua happened last year, but that's pretty rare to see a profile like that hit. So with all that context said, I think when you look at Marvin Harrison and the names he goes around, I don't have a problem with where he's going. I know wide receiver 9 feels like a lot, but I mean, it's right next to Drake London, who I like. I think you can make an argument for Drake London over him, but I think taking Harrison over Drake London's also fine. We already mentioned Chris Olave. Brandon Ayuk, I'm fine taking Marvin Harrison over Brandon Ayuk. I love Brandon Ayuk, but he's got Deebo Samuel. We got George Kittle. We got CMC. Marvin Harrison could be just him and Trey McBride, and they have a capable quarterback with Kyler Murray. Like, I mean, I feel like the ceiling without an injury is higher for Marvin Harrison this year than it is for probably Brandon Ayuk, all things considered. Like Davante Adams, we're going to talk about him in a minute when we get to these aging receivers. So I can see taking Marvin Harrison. So I think once you really think through all that and get past the sticker shock of, oh, it's a rookie, I think it's fine. I think it's fine where he's going. I think you can make an argument for him over around where all the other guys that are going immediately around him. I will say it's a bit of a thin bet. He basically needs to be Justin Jefferson to beat his ADP. You know, I mean, and as much as we talk about, yeah, we've seen more of this in the last few seasons. Still, being a rookie wide receiver to come out and be that great is not easy. There's still a chance Marvin Harrison's a wide receiver 3 this year, and he's not a wide receiver 1. So there's some risk with it. It's not the thinnest bet ever. It's not the most juicy bet ever, but I also get it. When you start looking the other names around him, I think you can make a case for Harrison over most of those names.
At least give Marvin Harrison Jr. a wide receiver 2 floor. Dwayne, don't put that out in the universe. Nobody wants to hear the wide receiver.
Low end wide receiver 2 floor.
Oh, thank you. Much easier to hear that one. Malik Nabers. This is one where there's little to no competition for touches on the offense that seem that they could kind of hold Malik Nabers back. For me, it's kind of hard to see Malik Nabers not touching the ball at a very high rate and being the highest targeted rookie wide receiver, if not one of them. And with his explosive ability, to me, he makes a lot of sense where he's going. Are you there on Nabers?
Yeah. I mean, again, he's wide receiver 19. We're talking about him going around guys like DK Metcalf, DJ Moore, Stefon Diggs, Devonta Smith, Mike Evans. I think he makes sense in that range. The biggest holdup with Malik Nabers, outside of there is a chance he's a rookie, he may not hit. These are not all guarantees. You're better. You know, we know who DK Metcalf is. He's not going to, at his age, it would be very against the odds for him to suddenly just completely flop. But if you ask me today, who has the bigger upside, I think it's Malik Nabers. Like, I think Malik Nabers is the one that has a better chance of becoming a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. The biggest hang up for Nabers is he plays with a piece of junk quarterback. I mean, Daniel Jones is terrible, but Daniel Jones is good enough to at least get him the ball. You know, yeah. I don't think any of us are going to sit here and think that Daniel Jones suddenly becomes a 4,000-yard passer with Malik Nabers. That's not the way that it works, but he might get to 3,500, 3,600. And if Malik Nabers is getting a 30% target share in that offense, I think he could still come up with 1,100, 1,200 yards, score 7, 8 touchdowns. Like, you're going to be pretty happy with Malik Nabers where you're getting him. And if you get lucky on some efficiency run out stuff, maybe he scores a couple of long touchdowns, you could do even better. So I'm with you. I think he's absolutely the number 1 target. The Giants have nothing. The Giants, I mean, geez,
absolutely nothing.
Talk about a really, really gross offense. I think it's all got to go to Malik Nabers, and he's good enough to make a lot of things still happen on his own, even though his quarterback is really, you know, Daniel Jones is the bus driver. He's a bus driver type quarterback, not going to elevate a bunch of players around him, but he's also not a hyper inaccurate quarterback. We know that when he does target Malik Nabers, it's probably going to hit him in the numbers, and that's the main thing. Yeah,
and I think they'll have creative ways to get him the ball. We saw what happened, certainly a different situation, a different level of quarterback, and a more experienced wide receiver. But the last time Brian Dable got a elite pass catcher in the offseason, we saw Stefon Diggs targeted 160 times. And that was certainly not an offense that was targeting wide receivers at that rate. Guys like Cole Beasley, John Brown, they get a elite one, and then it sort of happens. So
I think Daboll's a good coordinator.
Yeah.
A good coach, period. I know he's the head coach, but I think he's a good offensive guy. It does sound like he's going to call plays again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Malik Nabers is the one who's going to sort of save his job. I think the other pathway would be JJ McCarthy's a giant. They're forced to use him early, and there's no weapons there. That would have been cut probably the end of Dable. So a lot of pressure on him, but I think Nabers is going to deliver. So glad to hear you on Nabers there. Big relief for a lot of us Nabers drafters, Dwayne. One guy who, before we
real quick, I'll throw something out there on Nabers.
Yeah.
Like the biggest threat really is Daniel Jones. So historically, if you go back to 2011 and you look at, guys that have gone on to become let's just say wide receiver 7 to 12, right? So that's scoring 16 to 18 and a half fantasy points per game. And you look at guys around where I think the Giants will be, 225 passing yards per game, only 5% of the guys in that bucket. So they had to have a minimum of 250 routes run. And then, I pitted that against their team passing yards per game and said, okay, how many of that group ended up turning into wide receiver ones? Only 5%. If we add on another 2% of those guys actually did become top 6 wide receivers. So 7% total. So it's not like the worst odds ever. Like there's a chance, like we're saying, there's a chance it could happen, but more than likely, I feel like that wide receiver 2 range is a real sweet spot where you're essentially drafting Nabers. But I think there's still just enough upside there, even in a lower end passing attack, because it could be so consolidated that you might still squeeze out a wide receiver 1 finish.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of nailed it. And it's also Nabers could be a guy where could get red hot and give us the spike weeks in the right time frame.
Look what DJ Moore did last year in a not a
yeah.
good, really still not a great passing offense. I mean, the Bears were not a good passing offense as far as yards per game go last year. So when it's super consolidated like it was for DJ Moore last year, Malik Nabers could get that.
One more young wide receiver to touch on. We touched on Olave a little bit, but I think one player who's a ton of enthusiasm about, but it seems like we could be potentially drafting him towards his ceiling is Drake London. Drake London is wide receiver 10 right now. Again, 23 years old. We've seen him have an exceptionally high target share as a rookie. But again, 14th overall on underdog. So doesn't really have a lot of wiggle room here, Dwayne. In or out on Drake London in Atlanta?
Oh, I'm in, man. The underlying data tells us that this is worst case is a high-end wide receiver 2, might be a wide receiver 1. That's what the talent profile says. We're going from one of the worst passing attacks in the league over the last 3 years. I mean, we had to deal with Desmond Ridder, Marcus Mariota. I mean, this is just, Taylor Heineke got out there for a little bit. Just a terrible quarterback situation. So you're going from a team that was, 200 to 220 passing yards per game to getting Kirk Cousins, who's going to take you to around 270 passing yards per game. So that's a huge improvement. And we have historically seen for guys that are high-end target earners like Drake London, when they have had a swing like this, now there's not been many, it's not been often, but when they've gotten that bump, it's worked out great. Emmanuel Sanders turned into a wide receiver 1 with Peyton Manning. So did Eric Decker. Eric Decker got the flip side of that. He then left Peyton Manning and went back to a crappy situation with the Jets. And what happened? He became nothing. So looking at the talent profile for what we have with Drake London, then looking what we're going to be getting out of Kirk Cousins, the biggest risk here is maybe Kirk Cousins is not ready, but at least drafting Penix, there's a better floor than what we had before, right? It's not Marcus. Yeah. Our floor isn't Marcus Mariota under center. It could be Michael Penix under center, which I still think, obviously Kirk Cousins is the choice we want this year, but Penix is still a better backstop. So yeah, I absolutely love Drake London. I mean, I was hoping, this is how far fantasy's come. People are so much sharper. There's so much good analysis, and just the drafters themselves are drafting so many more teams. I was really hoping Drake London would be a late round 2 pick this year, but that ship sailed a long time ago. Like, he's been sitting here at the 1-2 turn now for over a couple of months, but I'm good with it. I think that's still where he should be sitting. I haven't drafted him as much as when he was going a little bit later. Like, I got a ton of exposure on his way up the board, but I'm still very willing to click on his name. I'd rather take him than Saquon Barkley in these leagues where you're required to start 3 wide receivers, or you can start up to 4 if you're in something like FFPC where you've got the 2 flex spots.
Yeah, no, I'm sort of with you, and I think you nailed it on the head that a guy like Drake London, based on what he did in year 1 and year 2, even with an improved situation, would have been like a 3rd round pick a couple years ago. Now you're having to take him in the early seconds. Yeah, it's people are not letting, and also I think people are more willing to bet on big breakouts and situations more so than There's a lot less I need to see it first drafter out there sort of in the nexus. People are betting on upside in situations a lot more, as they should. Last year doesn't do anything for us except for be an evaluation process tool. Let's pivot over. Let's talk a little bit about these old wide receivers. Why don't you talk a little bit about the article that just dropped and some of the research that came out of it? Specifically, you looked at the best 3-year stretches for wide receivers, defined the prime, and then looked at sort of a sliding scale. It was really, really interesting stuff, Dwain. Why don't you talk a little bit about it?
Cool. Thanks. Yeah. So just to kind of level set here, like the goal of the article, one is to set the background, like what does age mean for performance? When's the best time for wide receivers? When do they start to fall off? All that kind of stuff. But many people have done this article. There's a lot of great stuff out there that you guys can go check out from other sites. And there's been some amazing research done here. I think that Adam Harstead has done some really good stuff on this front. Fantasy Points, they've done a lot of really good stuff on this. So not necessarily groundbreaking, but even for this portion of the article, I looked at some of that work and I was like, well, I'm going to take a little bit of a different strategy. So some people compare a wide receiver's career, right, to, then their points each year or each age of their career. And most people did it based on season. So I decided to truly make this based on age. And you'll see that the way I define the prime years of a wide receiver, and that's what I wanted to compare to versus their career, because the career has, before they become good, unless they broke out as a rookie, and then also you're getting in their average, maybe 2 or 3 late years where they weren't good, and that's bringing down their average. So I'm like, no, I want to know, what are they versus their prime? And the way I define prime is I took their best 3-year stretch of their career, and then I compared each age bucket to that. So if you look at it, you just mentioned it, the sweet spot is age 24 to 27. Again, I want to mention, I'm rounding here. I'm rounding age either up or down based on their age beginning at the first week of every season. So if you've got a wide receiver that's going to be 26.6 technically starting this year, he's going to go in the age 27 bucket. So just remember that as you hear me talking about this. It's just a methodology thing. And I looked at the data both ways. And honestly, it was a lot smoother when I used the rounding. So I think basically you want to pick the age they're closest to when the season starts, is the way that I'm looking at it. But age 24 to 27, man, 93% of the prime came from those years. And what that means is when you divide their fantasy points per game in those seasons by what they did in their best 3-year stretch, and then you look at that across all wide receivers, that was the bucket that graded the best. That's a grade A, 93%. The next best 2 buckets, age 21 to 23. So that's, obviously they're typically rookies, 2nd-year receivers, 3rd-year receivers for some in that bucket, 84%. But tied with that was ages 28 to 29 at 84%. So that's kind of that's an important distinction there, because I do see some people get so hellbound or hell-bent on, it's got to be the young guy, the 23-year-old, not the 28-year-old. This data is telling us actually they're about the same. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to work out that way every time in every case. And there's context that we would always look at. What does their depth chart look at? What's their quarterback? There's things that are going to help you tie break some of those things, but don't let age be the only thing driving you there. If I had to just flip a coin on it, I still want to take the younger guy, because hopefully he might ascend a year early into his prime versus somebody that might come down a year early past their prime, but they're pretty much the same. Okay. Now, once you get to age 30, I'm not doing buckets anymore. It's just age 30, because this is where you start to see a distinction. 78% versus their best 3 seasons in their prime. That's the percentage of production you're getting. And then you get the real drop off. Age 31, that drops out to 68%. Age 32 down to 63%. And then 33 plus, I went back to another bucket. You're down to 54%. So again, like if you kind of zoom out and you think about this, we should be aggressively targeting, and you're already probably doing this, guys between 24 and 27. They're in their prime. They're probably going to keep doing what they've been doing. 21 to 23, 28, 29, those are really still the same. You got guys that are warming up to their prime and guys that maybe they lose a little, but they're still savvy enough. They know what they're doing. They still got enough talent in the tank to be productive from a fantasy standpoint. But after that is where it really gets a little bit more scary. At age 31 plus, like, I think we need to be, much more intentional. We're going to have to really make sure that we're focusing in on the right things. And that's really, we can stop here for a second, Theo, but that really was a setup to lead to the main question, which is, okay, great. When do these wide receivers typically hit a cliff? Because that's the thing we don't want to be left with. We don't want to take
hold the bag.
Right. We don't want to be left holding the bag. And what I define a cliff as is being below wide receiver 3. Now, some people will look at that and they're like, man, that's pretty aggressive. But let's be honest. How often have you been excited about starting a wide receiver 4 on your fantasy team? It's not winning you a championship. It's not winning you a bunch of money. So I'm calling that the cliff, even though technically, if you look at him from an NFL perspective, you might be like, oh man, that guy still had 750 yards and 4 touchdowns at age 33. That was pretty good. Yeah, it was, but it wasn't winning you anything for fantasy football. Maybe you got a couple spike weeks out of it in best ball, but overall, that's not the profile I want to be targeting. So I really wanted to dig in. When is the typical, drop off? And so to do that, I decided based on when I was looking at the data, I really need to split this into 2 subsets. The first subset being elite wide receivers. So they had at least 4 wide receiver 1 finishes in their career on their resume. Then the next bucket below would have been what I just called, I know, real innovative term here, good wide receivers. Okay. So these are guys that had at least 3 top 24 finishes on their resume, but it couldn't have been 3 wide receiver 1s. They might have had 2 wide receiver 1s spread apart, and then they at least had another top 24 finish where they were a wide receiver 2. But for these guys that were elites, Theo, it's pretty interesting. At age 30, you're still safe. We know that the production's coming down because we just talked about that in that table. But the average fantasy finish is still 16.4 points per game. That's wide receiver 1 since 2011. The cutoff is 16 points per game to be a wide receiver 1 in PPR. But here's where it gets, actually, age 30, you're good. 50% of them were still a wide receiver 1. 17% were wide receiver 2s. 33% were wide receiver 3s. 0% of them ended up turning into a wide receiver 4 or worse. So you avoided all the busts. But age 31 gets more tricky. Your average score goes down to 14.1. That's basically the bottom end of a wide receiver 2, but there was still upside. 46% of them were still wide receiver 1s if you knew which ones to pick. But here's the scary part. 46% of them fell to wide receiver 4. So guys that you didn't want to have in your fantasy lineup if you're trying to win serious dough. And really those trends continued. So the guys that got to 32 pretty much mirrored that I just gave you. But then once you got to 33, man, like even the average score dropped to 11.9 fantasy points per game, which is below the 12. Technically, the average for a bottom end wide receiver 3 is 11.8. So whatever. You can call him a low end wide receiver 3. You still didn't want them. You weren't wanting these guys in your lineup. And so 0% hit the wide receiver 1, and almost half of them were wide receiver 4s or worse. So age 30, you're good. Age 31 and 32, we need a strategy. Like, okay, great. Is there something else we can look at here that would tell us how do we flip the coin and get it to land on the right side? We want the guys that are still wide receiver 1s, but we don't want to be drafting those guys that fall off. And then at age 33, man, it's starting to get rough. You really, especially if ADP is high, you want to be getting away from these players. So I think it's good. We'll get into some of the other drivers here in a minute, but I want to stop because I've been talking for a long time and I feel weird. So
no, it's and I would say this is something where you guys keep everything free, and you guys should absolutely reference this article because there's charts and it's easy to follow along with. I know Dwain sort of gave a math lesson, but let's look at actionable information and math lesson in a very fun way, Dwain. I want to.
No, I'm with you. Hey, I'll be honest. Like one of the things I work on the most is how do I deliver information? And you're trying to give a lot of information, do it in a way that people can easily digest and keep up with. And I don't always do the best job at it. I'm still a work in progress.
No, you do a great job with it. Let's do some actionable usage of this information. So we're going to ignore Tyreek Hill because I think Tyreek Hill, you would agree, has less red flags and the level of production is incredible at this point. Or do you want to add anything with Tyreek?
No, I think you're good with Tyreek. What I would say just real quick before we jump into these names.
Oh, yeah.
The next step I took was, okay, now going in and looking at all the underlying data to see, are there indicators around these players that would tell us which ones might be more close to the cliff versus the ones that might still have another wide receiver 1 season. And let's stay talking about the elites, and Tyreek Hill's obviously one of those. So just real quick, what I did there is, number one, we have to know what things are the most predicted to future fantasy points from this year A to year B next year. No surprise, fantasy points per game is number 1. So that's one of the things that I looked at. But what was really interesting, Theo, is whenever I then split that into wide receivers under age 30 and age 30 plus, because I need to focus on this subgroup. I need to focus on the guys that are getting older and say, are there tells around them that help us? A really interesting thing occurred, and I want to shout out Jacob Gibbs. He had a great thread the other day where he was talking about these older receivers, and he had noticed some of the man coverage trends. And what's interesting is when I did this work, and you guys can go check out the article and you'll look at the table, you'll notice that suddenly their ability against man coverage shoots up into the top 8 rank for guys at age 30 plus, where it was not a factor for guys under age 30. It wasn't, not that it wasn't a factor, but it wasn't in the top 8. Now, I want to say this. At age 30, the predictive nature of every one of these stats I looked at went down versus under age 30, which you should expect. That already makes sense. We already talked about where their prime years are. So, period, those guys are playing better in those years. But when I looked at this man cover stuff, it was really interesting. So air yards against man moved to rank 5. It was like 12 before this. Man yards per route run moved to rank 6. Now, I wanted to note here, not a super high predictive value, 0.22 and 0.220, or won't get too much math here, but the R squared values. But still, when we're ranking out things that mattered the most, it was still their points PPR per game and their target share and air yards. But after that, the man coverage stuff really became important. So sorry, I know that was kind of a long, like, hey, let me say this one thing, but I'm going to talk about these things when we go through these players as being reasons why I'm in or out.
Yeah, and I love how you quantified it. And I think we talked a little bit in the pre-show about this, about sort of you look at the elite versus the non-elite, the wide receiver 1s versus the wide receiver 2s, sort of the wiggle room you have to decline and still be actionable. I thought that was very cool, because I think a lot of people would have just thrown this into a bucket and looked at his age. You specifically looked at some situations. So we touched on Tyreek briefly.
Yeah, we don't have to talk about Tyreek.
We can leave him alone.
Tyreek's good. I'll just say that.
Really good.
No signs of decline. He's definitely in the age bucket where a sudden cliff could happen. So the other thing you'll see in the articles, I broke down the kind of cliff. Okay, so if you look at the elite wide receivers, 22% of them never hit a cliff. They just retired. They went off into the sunset. Okay, but then 22% of them also hit a sudden cliff, and what that means is no warning at all. Went from a wide receiver 1 to a wide receiver 4. Okay. But the rest of them, we had some sort of signal. So you had a gradual decline, which means you were a wide receiver 1. Maybe you stepped down to a wide receiver 2. Then you were a wide receiver 3. Then you were a wide receiver 4. So that's a sign. And remember, PPR points per game are still the biggest predictor to next year. So that makes sense. Then there's another group I called turbulence. And what that means is maybe you're a wide receiver 1, and then you're like, oh, I'm a wide receiver 2. And then I bounced back to being a wide receiver 1. They never technically hit a cliff because they didn't fall to wide receiver 4, but that's turbulence. And then there's also injury. These guys that are 30 plus, when they suffer an injury that keeps them from running at least 200 routes in a season, 12% of them fell into that bucket. But once you add it all up and you look at the guys that did hit a cliff for elites, for the elite guys, 71% of them, they were either gradual, turbulence, or injury. So meaning we had some kind of warning in their PPR points per game telling us, hey, heading into age 31, 32, 33, and these things are happening. We need to take notice on those kind of players.
So there's a couple guys that I think this information is going to be very actionable on. And I want to get your opinion using some of this data.
Yeah.
Certainly when you take away Tyreek Hill, the most expensive old guy this year is Davante Adams. He is 31 years old. He has quarterback concerns.
He'll be 32 in mine because he will be closer to 32 than 31. So when somebody looks at the chart and they see 32, just remember rounding.
169 targets or more for 3 straight seasons, Dwain. So there's some, like, there's still some people very excited to draft him where he's being presented. Others are fading him this year. What does this data say about Davante?
So Adams has signs of decline. So that's the next breakdown, right? And you're talking about the players, and I go into ADP. Are there signs of decline based on the research that was done? Does he check any of these boxes? And then action at ADP. So here's the thing. Adams fell to 70% of his prime production last year. Now, his prime was very high. So that was still a high-end wide receiver too. You got 15.6 fantasy points per game. But remember, at his age, when you start to see the decline in PPR per game, you got to pay attention. Then when you put on top of that, the fact that his yards per route run against man coverage fell to 1.66, that's not good. That's actually terrible. And in 2022, he already started the decline where he fell from 3.04, or sorry, it was 2023. When he was in 2022, he had 3.04, and then in 2023, he fell to 2. I'm saying this all wrong. Just forget, guys. It was 3.04, then it went to 2, then it went to 1.66. So we got a 2-year trend, is what I'm saying, on the downward spiral as far as his ability against man coverage. I will say there's an example in the data of someone like Davante Adams bouncing back, and it's Larry Fitzgerald. And it was at a very similar period. He looked like, and he actually had fallen to a wide receiver 4 performance and turned around at age 32 and was a wide receiver 1 again. But the year before, you know what happened? Carson Palmer was hurt. And then he got his quarterback back. I'm still concerned about Davante. We don't have a change here at his quarterback position. We added Gardner Minshew, but who's really that excited about Gardner Minshew? Gardner Minshew's not Aaron Rodgers, guys. You're not getting Aaron Rodgers back. And you added Brock Bowers, an elite tight end in the draft. So you've got more target competition. You've got a guy that's already shown signs of falling off PPR, and the man coverage data, even though I wouldn't call it predictive at this point, it's still descriptive, but it is in the top 8 things that have shown to matter for guys age 30 plus. That is also a red flag. And when you put ADP into the mix, that's when it becomes a challenge. He's wide receiver 13 right now. So people are basically betting on him as a high-end wide receiver 2 with a chance to still be a wide receiver 1. I think he's a better bet, like if he fell to mid-range wide receiver 2 or low-end wide receiver 2. There, I would be more comfortable with his ADP. But right now, Davante is a fade.
We go down the list, and Mike Evans is an interesting one. Dwayne, I would say, based on his profile and his current ADP of wide receiver 17, despite the age, based on what we saw last year, I'm a little less concerned about Evans. Do you share that with me, or do you have some concerns here?
Yeah, one, I like the ADP's fine. We're pricing him as a mid-range wide receiver 2. He's definitely at the age where we could get a sudden drop-off. But remember, for the elites, that's only 22% of the time. So 1 in 5 chance that these guys just hit a cliff with no warning. With Evans, the interesting part is there has been some turbulence over the last 4 seasons, right? I mean, essentially, he's gone wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1. But that's really been the MO for his career. And if you think about Mike Evans and the way he wins, with the big plays and the touchdowns, it's been a little bit more in the nature of his profile. So I didn't want to overreact to that. But I do have to acknowledge, in a case like his, we wouldn't necessarily be able to determine, is the skill set eroding based on his PPR points per game. It could be a tricky situation to diagnose. Now, when you add in the next layer, he's an absolute monster, man, against man coverage. He did not show any signs of slowing down. 3.37 yards per route run. Remember what I just said about Davante Adams, 1.66. This dude was at a 3.37. Really the biggest factor in some of the down years he's had in the last couple of years. What's interesting about it, it's Tom Brady. Because Tom Brady, when you get zone coverage and you're running the deep routes that Mike Evans also often runs, he's not going there. He's like, I'm not throwing into that coverage. I'm going to Chris Godwin. Well, Baker said, YOLO, I don't care. I'm going to Mike Evans, period. And that was a big thing. The biggest improvement for him last year, Baker targeted Mike Evans 24% of the times he faced zone coverage. Under Tom Brady in those 2 down years that he had, 16 and 19%. So overall, I'm good with Evans. If he was going like where Davante Adams is going, I would be a little more leery, but I think at his current price, I'm willing to be even with the market. I'm not trying to be overweight on Mike Evans, but I also don't want to avoid him because I think he could still have a really good year left.
So we'll leave some meat on the bone. Go check out Dwayne's article. We don't want to keep you here for 90 minutes or something, Dwayne. But I want to talk about one more wide receiver because I think this one's giving people a lot of pause. You have Stefon Diggs, who last year started the year out incredible fashion. Looked like the league winner at the wide receiver spot. Then we had a steady decline in the second half of the season. Had weeks where he wasn't really usable for a long period of time when the offensive coordinator switch went to Joe Brady. Now you have him at wide receiver 22, but he has increased target competition with Tank Dell and Nico Collins bracketing him in the ADP, not to mention Joe Mixon out of the backfield, not to mention Dalton Schultz, who had tight end 1 production with CJ Stroud last year. So Stefon Diggs is one where it's an eye of the beholder situation at ADP. Some people are all over him right now there. Some people are completely fading. Where are you at on this one?
Yeah, I'm buying Stefon Diggs as he's falling down the board. I can't tell you for sure who's going to be the top target for the Texans, but I like all of them. And when I look at Diggs's profile, number one, he was really bad down the stretch last year, 9.6 fantasy points per game. But that was more to do with the way the Bills changed their offense. They had a -3% drop back rate over expectation once Joe Brady took over. They turned into a run first team. The target share was still there, 28%. 28% target share for Stefon Diggs last year. Now, his yards per route run against man coverage, 1.88, not great, but also in his MO, he's had up and down years. If you look at just a couple of years ago, he was down, and then he bounced back up to a 2.65 in 2022. So this is a player that has 4 consecutive wide receiver 1 finishes. So the PPR points look good. Not too concerned about what the coverage data is telling us. The other thing is I just haven't found second half of the year splits to be predictive of what a player is going to do the next year. I'm a big fan of splits when they make sense. Like, okay, a quarterback changed, you had an injury, a new player was introduced to the offense. Like those are the reasons to do splits. But when people just are like, let's just cut it in the half of the year and do it there. Honestly, the way that split's landing, it's probably more to do with Joe Brady than it is to do with Stefon Diggs. So I'm not too concerned about what that looked like. So for me, when I look at Diggs, like he's not checking any of the boxes I'm worried about. Now, he plays on the Texans, who have a better overall wide receiver core than what he was used to playing with in Buffalo. He's going to have to deal with Nico Collins, who is a stud. He's going to have to deal with Tank Dell, who also is a stud. We could argue Tank Dell is going to be the number 1 wide receiver on this team. I can't tell you for sure, but what I will tell you is there's no way I'm fading Stefon Diggs. And if people are making that stand, I think they're making a mistake. I think you should be mixing all 3 of these players. And right now, Stefon Diggs is at a pretty good price. And in fact, I think now's the time to build your Diggs plus Dell stacks because he's sitting down here at this other end of the board. And people are often also letting CJ Stroud fall all the way back down to you at the end of the next round, or sometimes even in round 6. You can let him go by in round 5 and come back in round 6. So I'm trying to get Diggs while he's at this price. So I'm definitely a buyer because the historical data is telling us that he has not reached that point where we should be concerned.
Very interesting to look at Stefon Diggs. Tank Dell has sort of been my preferred choice because he's the cheapest. And you see even a larger gap between him, Collins, and Diggs when you get into the FFPC, NFC streets.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah.
Underdog, they're all expensive, but you don't have quite the wide receiver enthusiasm in those other 2 formats when you get to like wide receiver 3 land. So I think that's super interesting. I'd love to touch on every one of these old wide receivers, but if you want to know about Keenan Allen, Cooper Kupp, and you want to become just a better drafter when looking at these age situations, highly recommend Dwain's article. Before you get out of here, Dwain, you gave me 3 of your preferred wide receiver targets. You touched on Diontae Johnson. Maybe expand on him at wide receiver 44 land, and then we could talk about your other 2 preferred targets. And for all you agists out there, all these guys are pretty young, so yeah. Sit still.
Yeah, Diontae, I'll leave it at this. Like the dude's a high-end target. He's a wide receiver 1 where they target or whether it's against man or against zone coverage. He's already shown us he's got that elite upside to be a wide receiver 1. So I get it. There's the question with Bryce Young. So I totally understand that. But again, you're getting him at a wide receiver 4. You're drafting Diontae Johnson right now as a wide receiver 4, and I think you very likely could have a wide receiver 2, and there's still wide receiver 1 upside if Bryce Young suddenly clicks. Now, looking at George Pickens, he's a guy that last year, finally, we got to see him in an expanded route tree in the games when Diontae Johnson was not on the field. And he really showed another side to his game where he had been locked into more of this perimeter downfield guy. In those games without Diontae Johnson, they actually opened up his route tree, and he was very successful in working all of those areas. And we clearly saw it in his target share. If you look at his target share last season on plays without Diontae Johnson on the field, a 26%. Now, again, quarterback questions here. We got Russ Wilson or we got Justin Fields. There's not a lot of target competition. And I think the same thing's true for Carolina. Xavier Legette's going to have to come out there and prove it, et cetera. Might he surprise us? Yeah, but I think Diontae Johnson's the clear number 1 there. And I think the same thing here with George Pickens. He's really flashed wide receiver 1 upside. And now you're getting him in a probably condensed offense. I don't love the Steelers passing game, but I'm okay with Russell Wilson or with Justin Fields. And dude, it's just the price you're getting him at. You're getting to draft him, as a mid-range to low-end wide receiver 3. He could absolutely give you a great wide receiver 2 finish. It'd be a surprise to be a wide receiver 1. One of those 2 quarterbacks, you heard me talk about the passing yards per game, like one of them would have to surprise us, right? And elevate the Steelers' passing attack overall to the next level to get that wide receiver 1 finish out of him. But I think you've got a really good chance to get like a mid-range wide receiver 2 finish to high-end wide receiver 2 finish out of George Pickens. And then Polk, this is a guy that just had to battle for targets, coming out of Washington, where he had to play with Odunze. You also had Jalen McMillan there, and the supermodel accounts for that. It accounts for your target competition in college, also where these guys go in drafts. Like, he wasn't an elite prospect, but a really good prospect. And we've got a wide open depth chart. I mean, you tell me. Do you want to run Juju Smith-Schuster out there? No. Tyquan Thornton stinks. I think DeMario Douglas is going to play. But outside that, I think Jalen Polk and Javon Baker are the 2 guys. So when I look at Polk, high-end round 2 pick, even if you don't want to talk about the supermodel or anything else, there's a problem with the market pricing. Xavier Legette was a late round 1 pick. He's going how many picks ahead, how many rounds right now ahead of Jalen Polk? Like 2 or 3. You look at Ladd McConkey, you look at Keon Coleman, early second-round picks that don't really profile that much better than Jalen Polk. Man, they're going 5-6 rounds ahead of this guy. So it's just one of these market inefficiencies. It's not necessarily that I think Jalen Polk is for sure going to be this smash hit, but a high-end wide receiver 2 on a wide-open depth chart where we know eventually we're going to see Drake May. I think that there's some upside here for Jalen Polk, and he could be a wide receiver 3. Upside's probably wide receiver 2, but you're just getting him so cheap.
Terry McLaurin rookie season vibes, an open wide receiver.
Yeah, there you go.
Tree, and then like your Diontae Johnson argument, Diontae Johnson sort of in the ADP marketplace, it's similar to what we saw with Michael Pittman Jr. last year, where going right around wide receiver 3 land, Pittman was like wide receiver 36, gave you wide receiver 15.
Diontae's in wide receiver 4 land, man.
Wide receiver 44 right now in underdog. So even if Dwayne's wrong, it's not gonna hurt you because Diontae Johnson, unless he's hurt, is going to beat his ADP there. Now, we need him to beat his ADP, but this is a guy that could beat his ADP by 20 spots or more. And then Pickens, that's a great one. The one concern is the passing volume in an Arthur Smith-led offense, but Pickens at 125 targets with his big play potential, he's wide receiver 28. Hard to see him not returning value there. So this was really a lot of fun. Dwain, let everybody know where they can find your work once again and what you have coming out.
Yeah, you guys can find everything over at fantasylife.com. Obviously, more around rankings and tiers, all that stuff will be out. But the projections are already up on the site. My ranks are up on the site. Ian Hardis got stuff coming out every day on the fantasy side, as well as several of our other content contributors. So yeah, just go check it out, fantasylife.com. Also, you can check out our YouTube channel. We're pushing out the team previews right now. So we've done NFC East and AFC East. So those are all releasing like as we speak.
And you guys got Thor Nystrom, who was a guest on press coverage and absolutely crushed it. So congratulations.
Thor is amazing. So glad we got him.
He's awesome. And a big thank you to the press coverage audience. We crushed it in June. We're going to continue crushing it in July. Have a wonderful 4th of July and stick with us here. We're going to crush our leagues this season.